When people imagine the American Wild West, they usually picture a dusty Hollywood dream. Fearless cowboys pushing through swinging saloon doors, outlaws meeting at high noon, endless plains promising freedom and reinvention. For more than a century, movies and pop culture have sold us this image of rugged adventure, the birthplace of American individualism. But the real West? It was nothing like the legend behind the romantic stories were brutal realities, disease, violence, famine, and a lawlessness far darker than the movies ever dared to show today. We're uncovering why you most likely would not survive life in the true Wild West. A quick warning, some of what you're about to hear is disturbing, but it's part of the history that shaped America. Just getting out there was a deadly gamble. Thousands of families set off in covered wagons along routes like the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Pioneer Trail, and those same trails later became known as the longest graveyard in the nation. Surviving the journey west was already a miracle in itself. People often imagine gunfights and bandits as the biggest threats, but those were nothing compared to the real killers: disease, exposure, starvation, and accidents. Most settlers traveled more than 2,000 miles in creaking wooden wagons pulled by exhausted oxen. The roads weren't really roads at all, just muddy paths carved by the wagons before them. Every river crossing could sweep away an entire family. Every storm could turn a camp into chaos. And every night, people prayed they'd wake up the next morning. But the deadliest threat wasn't the weather or the landscape. It was illness. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, even drinking from the wrong stream could kill you within hours. Travelers wrote heartbreaking diary entries about burying loved ones beside the trail and moving on because stopping meant risking everyone else's life. By the 1850s, some stretches of the Oregon Trail were lined with graves so close together that they became landmarks. People said the wheels of passing wagons rolled over the soil of the dead every single day. It wasn't adventure. It was endurance. And only the toughest or the luckiest made it through. Even if you survived disease and the endless march west, the land itself was waiting for you. Hollywood makes the frontier look wide open and welcoming, but in reality, it was a place that tested you every single day. Clean drinking water was rare. Rivers dried up without warning, and whole groups collapsed from dehydration under the blazing summer sun. At night, temperatures could drop low enough to freeze people in their sleep. And then there was the wildlife. Most Americans imagined dramatic gunfights with bandits, but the real dangers were far quieter and far more merciless: rattlesnakes hiding in tall grass, wolves stalking wagons, swarms of insects eating through precious food supplies. Even hunting, which movies portray as heroic, was anything but. One misstep with a rifle could cost you a finger, a hand, or your life. Settlers wrote about men dying because their guns misfired while they were cleaning them. No doctors, no hospitals, just pain, infection, and hope. The wilderness didn't care who you were, what dreams you carried, or how tough you pretended to be. You earned every mile with sweat and fear. If you finally reached a western town, you might think the danger was over. In reality, you were stepping into a place that was barely holding itself together. These towns weren't the lively, colorful Hollywood sets we're used to. Most were clusters of makeshift buildings, saloons, gambling rooms, brothels, and a handful of stores thrown up almost overnight. The roads were muddy trenches, the air thick with dust, and the smell of animals and human waste hung everywhere. Law enforcement? Usually just one sheriff. If you were lucky, sometimes he was the only real law in a town of thousands. Guns settled disputes faster than judges ever could, and half the lawmen were former criminals themselves. Alcohol flowed non-stop. Fights broke out in the streets, in saloons, on front porches. Even standing too close to a drunken argument could get you killed by a stray bullet. Newspapers from the era described towns where a man could be shot dead for cheating at cards or for looking at someone the wrong way. For many, life in a western town wasn't a new beginning. It was a gamble with terrible odds. Movies love to show the Wild West as a playground for fearless gunslingers. But the truth is that most violence wasn't dramatic or honorable. It was sudden, ugly, and usually pointless. Bandit gangs roamed the countryside, attacking stagecoaches and robbing travelers who had nothing left to give. Cattle thieves operated in the shadows, stealing entire herds in a single night. Even the train's symbols of progress became prime targets for robbery. And justice? It depended on who you knew. Courts were understaffed if they existed at all, and jail cells were little more than wooden rooms that prisoners could break out of with patience and a pocket knife. So towns turned to vigilante, swordinary men who took the law into their own hands. Sometimes they stopped crime. Other times, they became something worse than the criminals they hunted. Newspapers from the era are filled with stories of lynch mobs, wrongful hangings, mistaken identities, and innocent people paying the price for a town's fear. What passed for justice was often just survival dressed up as righteousness. The West wasn't a land of noble duels. It was a place where danger hid around every corner, and where one bad moment could change everything. Daily life in the Wild West was a constant grind. Hollywood might show cozy cabins and cheerful ranch families, but the truth was far more brutal. Most settlers lived in cramped, dirt-floor homes that barely kept out the cold. Winters could kill livestock overnight, and summers baked the land until nothing grew. Food was a struggle. Fresh vegetables were rare, meat spoiled quickly, and supplies from the east could take weeks or months to arrive. People relied on whatever they could hunt, trade, or scrape together. Women faced an especially harsh reality. They worked sunup to sundown, cooking, sewing, hauling water, raising children often while isolated miles from the nearest neighbor. If they got sick, there were no doctors. If they were abused, there was nowhere to turn. And childbirth. It was one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. Many didn't survive it, and those who did often lost their infants to infections no one understood yet. The frontier wasn't a place of freedom. It was a place where survival overshadowed every dream. There's one part of the Wild West that Hollywood almost always gets wrong. The land wasn't empty. It was already home to dozens of native nations with rich cultures, languages, and histories stretching back centuries. When settlers pushed west, they weren't stepping into untouched wilderness. They were entering someone else's homeland, and that collision sparked tension, fear, and too often devastating violence. Movies glamorized dramatic standoffs, but most real encounters were far more heartbreaking. Broken treaties, disease brought unknowingly by settlers, competition over land and water, all of it fueled conflict that tore families and communities apart on both sides. Many native groups tried to negotiate, to coexist, to survive the tidal wave of newcomers. Others resisted when their land, their food sources, and their traditions were threatened. From the Great Plains to the Southwest, the struggle reshaped the continent in ways still felt today. The frontier wasn't a heroic battlefield. It was a tragic meeting place of two worlds, and one of them paid a far heavier price. One reality of the Wild West that rarely gets attention is how deeply isolating it was. Days could pass without seeing another face besides your own family. And when trouble struck, you were completely on your own. Most towns had no real churches, no stable community life, and no place for people to come together in a meaningful way. The result was a kind of moral vacuum, a sense that rules didn't matter because no one was around to enforce them anyway. This isolation took a heavy psychological toll. Diaries from settlers described loneliness so intense, it felt like a physical ache. People battled depression, fear, and hopelessness long before those words were understood. Some turned to alcohol. Others simply vanished, walking off into the wilderness and never returning. For many, the true danger of the frontier wasn't a gunfight or a rattlesnake. It was the quiet, consuming weight of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. By now, one thing becomes painfully clear. The Wild West wasn't the birthplace of freedom and adventure that movies celebrate. It was a harsh, unforgiving world built on survival, luck, and constant danger. Hollywood romanticized it, the heroic sheriffs, the perfect sunsets, the noble cowboys riding off to glory. But those images are just fragments of truth, polished for the screen and stripped of the suffering underneath. In reality, most people weren't gunslinging legends. They were ordinary men and women fighting to stay alive, burying loved ones, chasing scarce resources, navigating conflicts no one fully understood, and enduring hardships that would break most of us today. The true story of the West isn't about swagger or bravery. It's about resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about people pushed to their limits by nature, by violence, by loneliness, and by a world changing faster than anyone could keep up with. The myth is glamorous. The truth is sobering. And understanding that difference reveals far more about American history than any movie ever has. So why does the real story of the Wild West matter? Because it reminds us that history isn't made of legends, it's made of people. People who struggled, who failed, who endured more than we can imagine, and who shaped a nation through hardship, not heroism. The frontier was brutal, yes, but it was also transformative. It tested millions of lives and exposed the raw edges of human nature: courage, fear, greed, survival, and the desperate search for meaning in a world with no guarantees. The myths are comforting. They give us clean lines, clear heroes, easy answers. But the real West forces us to confront something deeper: that progress often comes with a cost, and that the stories we tell about our past can hide more than they reveal. If you've stayed with us this far, thank you. Uncovering the truth behind the legends is what this channel is all about. And there are countless more stories waiting beneath the surface of history. This is how we got there, and we'll see you in the next journey into the past.